Hi, human development students. Today we're going to be talking about social transitions in adolescence. And again, if you have any questions whatsoever, please come to office hours and or on Wednesdays and or send me an email and we could chat about any questions you may have over email or set up our own appointment for via Google Meet. So please, please, please don't hesitate to reach out if you need me in some way. But before we get into any questions, let's learn some new material. What do I mean by social transitions? Certainly there are many aspects to our social lives, and we're going to talk about relationships in the next lecture. So we'll be talking about parent-child relationships and peers. But when I'm talking about social transitions, again, these are one of the fundamental changes in addition to talking about the biological changes and the cognitive changes. Social transitions are basically our changes in our rights, roles, and responsibilities that occur in different points in our life, but specifically here we're looking at adolescence. So essentially, these are just changes in how society defines adolescence. What are we expecting adolescents to be able to do or not to be able to do? And across the world, we see adolescents going through social transitions. However, these social transitions vary quite substantially from place to place. So again, these changes are universal, but in terms of, the specific aspects of them, they look quite different. As just one example, I mean, in the United States, you are able to get your driver's license at 16, but even in the United States, some people can get permits at 14, some people can get permits at 15. If you're looking at places abroad, then there are a lot of people who can't get their licenses until 18. And obviously there are a lot of variations with those things too. But this is what I'm saying. Everybody is able to eventually maybe get a driver's license, but the exact expectations vary from place to place. If we think about the industrialized world, the Western world, compared to the developing world, and we're going to get more into this in today's lecture, you're going to see how these social roles and social transitions are quite different. So indeed, there are some cross-cultural differences, but we have to also think about it at the level of socioeconomic status and a lot of other factors that influence how society defines adolescence and how society defines which rights and responsibilities should be given to adolescents and which ones should not be. There are various individuals. These could be psychologists, they could be anthropologists, they could be sociologists. They don't all have to be social scientists, but who question whether this period of adolescence is even real. Like, is it just a creation based on society's expectations? Because these expectations vary so much, is this just a social invention? So first I want to draw your attention to this question of, where do we draw the line? There's this statement that exists that adolescence begins in biology. So essentially we're talking about puberty, and that it ends in culture, which is really, really hard to define. And we also talked about how puberty and the onset is quite variable from person to person. So where would you draw the line? How do we even do that? If we were in class, I'd have you turn to your partner and think about these ideas of where do we draw the line? Is it this period known of adolescence real? Is it separate from adulthood? And how do we define it? There isn't one right answer to this question. There are many answers. The answers depend on culture. The answers depend on different factors. So we know that, by and large, though, there are biological cognitive changes. We already talked about those. But this time period really is defined by society. Is it a period that is distinct from childhood or adulthood? It depends on who you ask and it depends on where you're living. We're going to talk more about that. There are other individuals, and I think that there's a lot of validity to this idea, but that when we see problems in behavioral problems in adolescence, oftentimes these problems are emerging because of the way that adolescents are treated. So essentially, if we have these ideas that adolescents are going to be getting into trouble and making problems for society, if we have these expectations and we're going into our interactions with adolescents with these expectations, because these are just our beliefs, this can lead to a self-fulfilling prophecy on the part of adolescents. So when we think about adolescence again as a time period of maybe turmoil or we use the term storm and stress, is that just an invention or is that reality? Individuals who believe that adolescence is a social invention, again, not its own unique time period, but something that's just defined by society, have a couple of pieces of evidence for this. So the first evidence comes from a historical perspective and the idea that this period of adolescence, as we know it, has not always existed. If we think back to, times when children were out doing work, they weren't going to school. Again, let's say before the Industrial Revolution, but it does depend on where you live worldwide. Children are essentially mini adults. They were providing labor in order to make sure that the factories were run, in order to make sure that the coal mines there were people working in the coal mines, and so on. So certainly we know that there were still biological changes taking place. So puberty was still happening. There were still changes that were happening cognitively, but were individuals during this time period really given an experience of adolescence as we know it today? Certainly not, right? And if we think about how many of these adolescents back in the day may have gotten married really young, had children really young, that they didn't attend schooling. Not that saying schooling is for everyone, but their lives were totally different. Their social lives were totally different. So what does this mean for this period known as adolescence? Another argument, again going along with this industrialization idea, is that with industrialization, this period of adolescence totally changed. There were new patterns of work, as I just described. We're not, and if I asked you right now, when did you have your first job? It certainly wasn't a serious job at the age of 7. We have new patterns of education after industrialization. Family life looked different. Again, maybe you weren't necessarily working with your family. You no longer did what your family did, like you're in the same trade. And children were put into schools. This had two main functions. By being put into schools, this protected adult jobs. So this means that when things started to become mechanized and when factories started to, if we have these machines that are working, we don't necessarily need people doing the individual tasks. So there may have been less jobs at certain points, again, depending on where you lived. And essentially, if those jobs are limited, we need to make sure as a society that adults who are providing for a family, or one can assume, need to be having those roles, those jobs, and we're going to not have as many jobs for children or adolescents. But also it's protecting children themselves from labor, and we've learned more information about how, having a hard job is going to be taxing on the body and stressful. And so this is necessarily what we would want for citizens. So again, there's this whole change that occurred, different points in history depending on where we live in the world, but it's creating this new time period. Instead of being pushed into early adulthood, we have this time in our lives, by and large, where we are able to go to school and perhaps choose a different path than our parents. Maybe we end up doing the same path, and that's fine too. But it's not the same just every day in, every day out. that it once was. In reality, these changes to create an adolescence more like it is today, it's not that old. Only about 100 years ago, we start to see adolescence viewed more as it is today. This kind of period is a preparation for adulthood. This period of being between childhood and adolescence. I'm certainly not saying that adolescence 100 years ago looks the same as it does today. We know that that's not true. And in a few lectures, we're going to be talking about this time period known as emerging adulthood, which people are actually, like researchers are actually saying is a new period in the lifespan. We've already talked about how adolescence has become elongated, but still, about 100 years ago, we start to see these bigger changes. Just some interesting topics related to that. This word teenager was first used in the 1950s. I feel like, obviously our lives, it's always been around. When the word was first used, it actually was kind of used in a way that was mocking or not to be taken as serious. And I guess like I think about this now as people throwing around the words like millennials or Gen Zers in a way that is looking down on individuals who are part of that period in the lifespan. And when the word was first teenager was first used, it was used in a way in advertising and marketing. This idea that teenagers are only concerned with cars, clothes, and cosmetics. And we can argue today what some people might say, again, teenagers or adolescents are really consumed with. In the 1950s, when we were out of World War II, and there were people who wanted to be spending money, and the marketing agencies, advertising agencies, really wanted to take advantage of this. So this led to a huge advertising boom geared at adolescents. So to me, in some ways, the word teenager still has a negative connotation. When I think about the word adolescent, it seems very formal. I guess other people might use the word youth, but that sounds more of like a term grandma or grandpa would use. But teenager, I could see a lot of people, and I can hear this in my head that this is like, again, more negative, that you're not taking things as serious or that you can't take things as serious. So just keep in mind that our views of adolescence are still stereotyped and still quite negative depending on who you're talking to. But there have been, in some ways, little changes that have taken place, or few changes that have taken place in several decades.